This is our Richmond 6-speed main shaft assembly and cluster assembly. We're going to start first with the main shaft assembly, and we're going to lift it out carefully because we've got 3 sets of forks that we're going to lift off of. We are in neutral, spins freely, and we're going to lift this assembly out and do the main shaft assembly first, the tear down, and then we'll come in and do the cluster. But this is how that will look once you remove the main shaft. All right, this is our main shaft assembly. I've already taken the 2 snap rings off for the speedometer gear. This is speedometer gear on the back. Most of these snap rings on the back are the same, but you want to mic the snap rings. I do. I like to keep up with them and mic the snap rings, and you can use a pen or a pencil, write down the diameter or the thickness of these snap rings as you come apart, and this is the location. This is a new main shaft that I have, but you can do it any way you want to do it to keep up. But this is a new main shaft that I've got. This particular transmission is going to need a main shaft, so I got a new one, and I can lay everything out and I can kind of show you where the snap rings go and where the pieces go, and as we lay it out we can keep things together to where they go to and make a whole lot easier. This is the reverse slider gear coming off the main shaft. There's a few pieces that we can do on the bench here, but not all of them. And then some of this will have to go to the press and do in the press. But that's our slider gear, and remember the flange goes to the rear. That exposes our rear bearing, and the rear bearing has a snap ring behind it. Might as well take that off, and we can take the snap ring off right now. And I do recommend that you get a really good set of snap ring pliers. It's really going to aid in the disassembly of these things. And we'll get the snap ring off. We'll mic the snap ring. That's about an 86 thousandths, and it goes in this groove of the main shaft right there. So that one is a .086. And that's our 3 snap rings we've got off the main shaft right now. The rear bearing is pressed down. We'll have to go to the press and take it off. I like to have the exploded view of the transmission also, because we can see the pieces as we pull them off and make sure that we are good, that we have all the pieces. Because if this is the first time that you've been into a trans, you don't know if somebody else has been into one before or not, or how well it worked or didn't work before you take it apart, put it together. So we want to kind of go along with the sheet. But keep in mind, there are differences in transmissions where maybe an exploded view covers a decade of transmissions of the same design where they might have had a run and change. So just because it's a little bit different from the exploded view doesn't mean that yours is wrong. But just be careful in how you take it apart, and it's working good, then you can put it back together the same way. But this exposes our rear bearing, which is pressed down, first gear. And then I'll go to the front. This is our input, and it slides off, and it has a Torrington bearing on the inside of the input, along with our Bryce ring that goes for our 5th gear and 6th gear assembly. And then we will pull the front bearing off of this input. And also, these are kind of hard to pull off, and I have a puller that does that, so we'll do that. But these are the pieces on the front. That allows us to get to our 5th, 6th synchronizer assembly, and there is a sleeve on the front of this, which this sleeve is bad and will need to be replaced. It's got metal pulling off of it, and we're going to have to press this sleeve off because this sleeve is pressed down. We will go to the press now. I'll bring my snap ring pliers because we do have a snap ring behind this sleeve that we're going to have to pull back loose. We can't get the snap ring off, but we can pull a snap ring out of the groove and pull it behind the sleeve, where when we press this assembly off, it just presses all that off together. All right, I've got my main shaft assembly in the press, and I like to start on the first gear end, and what I'm going to do is press off first gear and the bearing. I looked at my exploded view, and there's no snap rings between any of these areas. This is a good place to press from, and you just got to be careful that you don't do any damage to the gear teeth as you're pressing this bearing off. It shouldn't be a lot of press, but it should be fairly snug. But we're going to get first gear off and out of the way and expose our 1-2 synchronizer assembly. And it should press fairly easily without a lot of load pressure. And you want a good hold on the main shaft, because this time you're holding up all the rest of the main shaft assembly. As I spread this and pull this out, you can see first gear, the Torrington bearings that are on the main shaft, and the synchronizer ring for first gear before our synchronizer assembly. So I'm just going to bring this off the shaft. We've got our bearing, and you know that the snap ring will go to the rear. This is our thrust washer for first gear. This is our first gear. And our synchronizer assembly, our synchronizer ring, excuse me, and our 2 Torrington bearings that this gear runs on. And now that exposes the snap ring at the back side of this 1-2 synchronizer assembly, and we'll have to remove it to be able to remove our synchronizer assembly so that we can remove second gear. All right, this is our next snap ring that we've gotten to. This one holds the 1-2 synchronizer assembly in place on the main shaft before we get to second gear. This snap ring will have to be removed, then we'll go back to the press and press off. According to my exploded view, there are no more snap rings beyond this one before we get to this part of the main shaft assembly, which we're looking at right here on this main shaft. There is a flange on this main shaft that separates second and third gear. So keep that in mind when you're pressing, is that we have to press the gears on the back side of the main shaft off the back way, and then the gears on the front side will go forward. But we've got snap rings that we got to contend with first. And the first one we come to is the one that holds the synchronizer, the 1-2 synchronizer. We'll remove it, then we'll go back to the press and press the gears off. But right now we're going to get this snap ring out of the way. If we can grab it. And it is a little bit snug on the shaft. And we don't want to do damage to it. This snap ring is different from the others, a different diameter and a different thickness. This one's about 121 thousandths thick. And it can go in 2 places on the main shaft. It can go either this position or this position, which is ahead of the synchronizer, but the correct position is before the synchronizer, and that's this spline part right here is what's under this hub. So you want to make sure that this snap ring is in the correct location, and that's another reason why it's important to do photos as you go along with this so that you put things back in the correct position where they need to go back to, so that your clearances and everything fits on the shaft and it works as it should when you get done. But that snap ring will go into this groove right here, and this groove right here is open. There's nothing in it, so we should be able to press second gear and that synchro assembly off at the same time, and it doesn't give you much room on each side of the ledge of the gear to be able to press, but that's what you have to do. And it would be better if we had some hive collets that go under this that we could use, but I don't have anything that thin and that strong, so we're going to go by the gear teeth here and press this off. All right, this is our main shaft assembly. Since we've removed first gear, we're under second gear, and we're going to bring second gear and the synchronizer assembly off in one press here. Bring this over into position, and this should press fairly easily, and a good hold on the shaft assembly so that when it comes loose it doesn't fall through. And remember, we talked about the orientation of the synchronizer assembly. It's going to be critical that you get these parts right when you go back together. So whatever you got to do to mark these to make sure that they are together and go back the same way, the marking or the photos right now are very critical, because this synchronizer assembly and this one, you just don't want to mix up parts. You want to come off together and go back on together. So now we're going to keep this together. I'm going to go back to the bench, and we're going to take that off as an assembly and mark it so that we know where it goes back to. All right, this is our components we just pressed loose. This is our synchronizer assembly, our 1-2 assembly. And now that we know which direction, if you've got an electric pencil and want to mark this on the front side, you can mark the hub to the slider. Then that way you know which way it goes back on and can put it back together correctly. Also too, you want to look around the hub and make sure there's no other marks on it that could confuse you when you go back together, or even on the other side, anything that's on the other side, because if it's been into before, or sometimes I've seen them assemble these and mark them new. So we've got it marked which way it goes, and we know this is the front of the hub and the front of the slider, so we can put it back together the same way. And this is our second gear coming off the main shaft, and inside that gear is the Torrington bearings, and it has a spacer that sits in the middle of these Torrington bearings to where the load is on the bearings on each side of the gear. It's important that you put the spacer in the middle and the bearings go on each side of the spacer. That completes the disassembly of this side of the main shaft, because this is from this area of the flange back, and you can see that we've unloaded first gear, the 1-2 synchronizer assembly, and second gear, gotten all our reverse off, and now we're going to focus on the front end of the main shaft, which has the third gear, fourth gear, sixth gear, and our 5-6 synchronizer assembly, and our sleeve on the front, and there's another sleeve under sixth gear that we're going to focus on when we do this. All right, we're back to the front of our main shaft assembly. We've got the back disassembled. This is the sleeve that sits on the front of the main shaft. You notice this one over here has no sleeve on it. This is a press-on sleeve. You also notice that I've got the snap ring that holds the 5-6 synchronizer assembly. It's off and on the splines just forward of the synchronizer assembly. Do this to where that when we press on our 6th gear that it brings all of this off together, because I just don't have enough ledge to press anything or pull anything without doing damage, which this sleeve is already ruined, but your sleeve may not be, and you want to get it off without doing any damage. So we're going to press this off as an assembly, and we'll go to the press now. All right, this is the front of our main shaft assembly, and right now we're pressing off the sleeve off of the front of the main shaft. And I'll pull it over into position, and all we're interested in right now is getting the sleeve off and making sure that whatever we use to press this isn't larger than the sleeve that we're pressing off. So I've got 2 collet plates. I've got it in position, and even though this is a bolt, it is still softer than the main shaft that we're pressing this sleeve off of. So we've got to get it positioned to where that it's straight. And then now I'm just going to press this through, and make sure that you have a hold of the main shaft assembly on the bottom side, because once it gets through this sleeve, it is free and loose, and it will come off very quickly. That's how quickly it'll come off. That exposes the rest of our main shaft, but this synchronizer assembly runs on this, behind this gear, behind 6th gear, and 6th gear runs on a Torrington bearing. Right now we'll go back to the bench and explain a little bit more about it. All right, this is the front of our assembly, and I've just pressed this sleeve off. This is the sleeve that goes on the front of the main shaft. And if yours is not, this one's ruined, this one is not good at all, but you don't want to do damage to yours as you remove it. So we press this off using all of this assembly. I had to get the snap ring forward of the groove so that it's set up here on the spline so I could press this forward and not do damage to it. So we have the sleeve, we have the snap ring, and the bearing out of the back of the input sits on that sleeve, and then the input sits on that bearing. So this is part of your pilot on the front of the main shaft to the front of to the rear of your input shaft. So you get an idea of how it goes. And this synchronizer assembly is not a press fit on this shaft, it's a slide fit. And at this time we want to mark this synchronizer assembly so that we know the front of the hub to the front of the slider, and that we can put it back together, because there is a difference in the front and the back of this hub, so you can put it together backwards. So we're going to mark it, and I don't see any other markings on the front or the back, so we're going to mark this so that we know the orientation that it goes back in. And this is the front of our synchronizer assembly, and that's 5th and 6th. This is our other brace ring, and this is our 6th gear. And 6th gear runs on another sleeve, has a Torrington bearing on it that goes in between 6th gear. So your assembly is coming together just like this. To make sure that you lay everything out correctly, then you've got, and like I say, just if you can't remember how it goes, it's best to take pictures. You can't have enough pictures. Now the next thing we're going to do is press. This is a sleeve that presses onto this shaft, and it presses on from about this area right here back, and it seats back here on the main shaft right here where 4th gear runs. So we're going to get this assembly off, and to do that we're going to have to use the outer synchronizer sleeve is how we're going to have to pull this off, because there's no way to get to this, and I don't have any metal, thin or durable enough to get into this groove to press this gear forward against the sleeve and press this off. So I'm going to use this sleeve assembly to press so that we can get to our synchronizer hub assembly, because remember, we have a snap ring right here in front of the synchronizer assembly that sits right down here under this brace ring, and if we don't get to it, we can't press all of this assembly off until we get that snap ring, and it's identical to this one in size. And we've got to get the outer part of this off first to get the sleeve off. We'll go to the press and I'll show you what we're doing. All right, this is a new slider sleeve that I have. This is what I'm trying to do. I've got two half plates that I can get into the sleeve on the main shaft, and I can use the sleeve to come up against the gear and pull the sleeve off of the front of the input. And that's what I'm doing now. Just give you an idea of how that's going to work. But I'm going to bring my main shaft assembly up through. All right, as you bring it up through, you're going to notice that this sleeve is going to come forward on your hub assembly, and that will expose your three synchronizer keys that you don't want to lose at this particular point in time, but it's the only way that you can get the sleeve off without doing damage. And I'll slide it into gear. Then as I press this on off, it's going to expose the keys that will fall down, and just have a way to contain the keys so that you won't lose the keys. And you'll have to have a hold of the main shaft assembly. You see the sleeve coming forward. All right, there's one of the keys. There's two of the keys. There's three of the keys. Those three keys we don't want to lose. Now we're going to go to the bench and I'll show you a little bit more about this. All right, what we just did was pressed our sleeve off the front of this main shaft, and this sleeve sits right here in this area right here on the main shaft, seats against where sixth gear runs. So, excuse me, where fourth gear runs. And this is the keys out of the synchronizer hub assembly. This is your keys that you don't want to lose. So what we did was press the sleeve off, which exposed our fourth gear and our Torrington bearing that runs on fourth gear. So there is fourth gear assembly. It turns this way, sleeve in front of it, and it turns this way, so that now it exposes the snap ring, where when we take this snap ring off, which is equivalent of this one, but it sits up here in this forward groove, and there's nothing in this other groove behind it. So we should be able to remove this snap ring, this one right here, and press the rest of our gear synchronizer hub assembly and brace ring off of the main shaft, and that will have the main shaft disassembled. We also want to make sure that we have the hub and the slider marked to where that we know that the slider sleeve fits this way, and that we mark the hub to where the hub and the slider assembly are in correct orientation. All right, there's our snap ring assembly, and that's the groove that snap ring goes into. We'll see what thickness that is. It's about 122 thousandths. So only about a thousandths difference between it and the other one. The other one was 121. But remember, it goes in the forward groove. Even though it can go into this next groove, there's nothing in that next groove. So that's our snap ring right there in the location. So we'll go to the press the inner hub out, and give us our third gear. All right, here we have the remaining part of our main shaft in the press. We've got our third gear and our 3/4 synchronizer hub, and we're going to press these loose. And good hold on the main shaft. Should press off fairly easily. Not a lot of effort. And now we'll go to the bench and remove the remaining parts from our main shaft. All right, what we just did was press the inner hub from our synchronizer assembly, from our 3/4 synchronizer assembly. Sits together just like that, exposing our third gear and the Torrington bearings and the sleeve, just like our second gear had. It's got a set of bearings with the sleeve in the middle of it. And then this is our brace ring. So now that we've got all our components disassembled on our main shaft, we can start cleaning up, getting everything laid out and in position, and be ready to, first thing we'll do is disassemble our cluster shaft assembly, and then we'll start assembling pieces. But you can get an idea now of where the pieces go, what they are, keeping everything together. And that's our main shaft assembly. All right, this is our transmission that the main shaft is all assembly still together, but I've got another main shaft with a front bearing I'm having to replace. So this is to show you, first you have to remove the snap ring on the front of in front of the bearing on the main shaft. And like I said, get you a dial caliper and check the thickness of this snap ring when you take it apart. The problem with a lot of these is the fact that the bearing's smaller than the gear. There's nothing to press against. And you can't hardly get a jaw puller in here to pull these bearings. So once you get it disassembled, I have a puller that I use that has 2 collets with a slide ring. And once I remove the front bearing, I can put the collets on, and they fit just like that. Put the slide sleeve on. And then all I got to do is run this down, and it contacts the front of the input where the drill dimple is, and then it pulls the bearing off, and you're able to pull a bearing assembly off without doing damage to the input or the gears. So these pullers, and they're available, they're a little bit hard to come by, but they are available. But if you do this for a living, you're going to need something like this so that you don't damage the input shaft, because these are extremely hard to come by also. So anytime you can do damage, you want to try to avoid it at all costs, because you might not be able to find the pieces to put it back together. So this is another way to get this assembly apart. Once you do that, you can get your new bearing, press it on, put your snap ring back on, and then that assembly is ready to put back together.